As always, our thanks to Kim, always ready at BevCam to keep track of us, keep us honest. So thank you, Kim. I'm going to have Ms. Dupont just quickly call the roll. We'll call to order the subcommittee and the committee of the whole.
Hausman?
Here.
Feldman?
Here.
Rotundo?
Here.
Flowers? Bowen?
Here.
Sweeney?
Here.
Spang?
Here.
Crowley?
Here.
St. Hilaire?
Here.
Great. So welcome everyone. Welcome to everyone on BevCam who's watching, and welcome to members of the Clean Energy Advisory Committee who are here, who will be hearing from a bit this evening, I think. Basically, we're going to follow the same format we did when Legal Affairs met the first time to have a discussion about the adoption of the Specialized Business Code. I'm going to start out with a few comments. Excuse me, start out with a few comments and then sort of turn it over to Jordan Stutz, who will make a presentation, PowerPoint presentation. The intent here is to answer the questions that came up at the last Legal Affairs Committee regarding this order, and then excuse me, have a a follow-up Q&A with any new questions and just sort of a general discussion, and go from there. So I'm going to just make a couple of quick comments here, and then I'll get off my soapbox and we'll get underway. So regarding, excuse me, hey Matt, perhaps you could get me a little bit of water from the cup if there's anything out there. I didn't bring anything. I appreciate it. We'll take a quick pause here. And hopefully there's some water out there.
I believe there is.
Okay. I'll wait until Councilor St. Hilaire is back in the room. Thank you, Councilor St. Hilaire.
You are, Mr. Chairman.
Appreciate it. All right. So just a couple of opening comments. My constituents expect me to do the hard work of solving problems and to not turn away from them. I believe the council should engage with the challenges that face our city and state, and that includes doing the hard things as well as the easy things. There's a question here regarding the adoption of the Specialized Building Code. Do we believe that city government can make important things happen? I do. There's a question here, when we find friction points, do we think that the council can remove barriers and meet challenges? I do. The issue has been raised at our last Legal Affairs meeting. Are there choke points and conflicts that are unsolvable between meeting our local and state competing goals for affordable housing on one hand and creating a clean energy transition on the other? Is meeting these goals an either-or proposition, or can they be yes and goals? A few years back, when Paul Gwanzi was council president, and he appointed me chair of public services, Beverly had 150 or so eyesore double poles spread throughout the city. And complaints about those double poles and requests to remove them fell on deaf ears with the utility companies. But I became quite unpopular with David Santana at National Grid because I told him that every non-essential electric connection request was going to stay in committee until National Grid started working with Comcast and Verizon to remove those double poles. Okay, it took a few months, but I held all of National Grid's non-essential permit requests until there were only four double poles left in the city. And thereafter, those National Grid requests, found easy passage to the committee. And the point is that as a city council, we can tackle friction points. We can use our leverage and our good offices to solve problems, big problems, as well as little problems. I've already started to create a functional process to address one of the permitting issues that Harbor Light Community Partners raised about National Grid when its executive director, Andrew DeFranza, met with the Clean Energy Advisory Committee at its last meeting. And by the way, he is on board with the adoption of the specialized code. There are some things he'd like to see happen as part of that passage, and we'll talk about that this evening. I think we can look at the adoption of the specialized building code as the start of a work in progress process to get to yes and, not decide it as an either or proposition. I think city government has the opportunity to solve some problems when it adopts the specialized building code. I acknowledge the friction points of cost and risk that have been raised by interested stakeholders. But those friction points are problems that we are uniquely situated and frankly called upon to solve for the stakeholders and, more importantly, for our constituents. For me, local government is in the problem-solving business. If there are concerns, let's not just hear them, let's tackle them head-on. It takes a commitment to problem-solving, so I say let's commit. And with that, I'll step off my soapbox and ask Jordan Stutt to make a presentation to the council before we start our discussion.
Thank you, Councilor Hausman. Thank you to all of the councilors for making some additional time for us after we've already been here once. I'm going to walk through a slide deck. Some of it will look familiar. I've recycled some of the slides. I don't expect that you've all been living and breathing specialized energy code since we were here 2 months ago. So there will be a little bit of a refresher, and then there will be some new slides to cover new things that we've learned. Some of those are to answer questions that were raised at the last subcommittee meeting. Happy to take questions as we go. Also happy to just work through it, and then you can lob them all at me. I'm also really happy to be joined by Nancy and Sarah, who are fellow members of the Clean Energy Advisory Committee, who each have their own areas of expertise, and I think together we can answer most of your questions. With that, a quick reminder on what the Specialized Energy Code is. It builds on the stretch code that is currently in place. In many cases, that stretch code will still be the code that is enforced, but in certain cases of new construction, this would step in. And I want to reiterate, it is just for new construction. It still does allow for mixed-fueled buildings, like buildings that are heated or use natural gas appliances, but does require some pre-wiring to support the transition to all-electric buildings in the future. It will also expand the use of solar energy where feasible in Beverly. And again, we are doing this because we need to, in order to meet Beverly's clean energy and climate goals, to protect building owners from future, more costly retrofits, to reduce our energy usage, and it will give us access to funding that can be applied to future building projects in Beverly. Same slide as you saw last time, but just reiterating that half of the city's emissions come from its buildings, and if we want to meaningfully reduce that, we need to ensure that the future buildings that we build are built more efficiently. Councilor Hausman noted the work that Paul Guanci had done when he was president of the city council. He was president of the city council during this Resilient Together process, including developing this list of recommendations for how to approach our buildings and how to reduce pollution from them, including identification of the adoption of a net zero building code, which is the specialized energy code, as a high impact, low cost priority. Discussed this slide last time too, but really just want to reiterate the progress that has already been made in building to the specialized energy code in the case of multifamily affordable housing, and note the significant amount of incentives and tax credits that are available, and that we see significantly reduced energy usage in buildings that are built to the passive house standard, which directly benefits the residents living in those buildings. This is a new slide, really a reformatted slide, but did just want to provide a quick refresher on the different types of buildings that would be subject to the specialized energy code. It does apply to small residential houses and buildings, so it could be a single-family standalone building. It could be small townhomes with a couple of units. Councilor Rotundo, I know we were speaking about some of those 2 to 3 unit buildings, so some of those would fall into this category. If you're building all electric, there's nothing new here. If you're building mixed fuel, there are a few additional requirements that would be put into place, including solar PV where feasible, and building to a zero energy code if you're going mixed fuel. And again, no additions, no alterations, and no historic home applications here. Similar when we're looking at large multifamily buildings, if you're building all electric, actually, regardless of whether you're going all electric or using mixed fuel heating and appliances, you will need to build to the passive house standard. If it's mixed fuel, you need to do that extra work to wire the building for future electrification. And for commercial and municipal buildings, no new requirements if you go all electric. If you do go mixed fuel, you need to put on solar PV where feasible. With that refresher over with, I do want to turn to a couple of the questions that came up last time. Let's see, Councilor Sweeney, one of your questions was around the impact to single-family homes, thinking through if we're assuming that $12,000 cost for pre-wiring and solar, what does that do? And I think there's a general concern about what we can do to ensure that housing is affordable, particularly looking at starter homes, looking at that missing middle. What I did here was I pulled all of the home sales from Redfin in Beverly, going back to the beginning of 2023, looking only at houses that were built in 2022 or later, so new construction. What we see, and that are smaller than 4,000 square feet to fit into this category. What we see is that there have only been 14 of these houses sold. They've got an average square footage of 2,900 square feet, average sale price of $1.3 million, and that pre-wiring and solar cost comes out to an average of roughly 1% on that $1.3 million average home. So that's not nothing. But I do think it's important in the context of what this means for affordability, just because when I look at that house, that list of home sales, that's not where I'm seeing the affordable housing development happening in Beverly at the moment. Any questions, comments on that? Yeah.
So the average sale price there is $1.3 million, which I think we could argue is not affordable for most of Beverly. Are those the only homes that qualify, or how would this impact other homes?
No, if somebody wanted to build, let's just say a more modest single-family home, it would still be subject to this code.
So it applies at all levels?
Yeah, it applies at all levels. It's just that in the private market today, nobody's building those new homes at that price point in Beverly.
Thank you.
If I may just jump in, I think, Jordan, one of the reasons you wanted to bring this forward was to show that over the period of time of, what does it cover, 22, 23, 24?
Last 2+ years.
That there have only been these 14 single-family homes even built in Beverly. It's not like there are a bunch of other homes that are not part of this that are single-family homes that were built. It's that the market for single-family homes is reflected here, and that market is not middle, if you will, middle class or more affordable housing. It's really only people who can afford $1 million or plus home who are even having homes built for them in Beverly.
And I should caveat, this is just what I was able to find on Redfin, so the data is as good as their data is.
I guess just to follow up on that, what is the point of that? Councilor Bowen?
Thank you. I mean, I think what it says to me is there are huge barriers to building new affordable single-family homes that have nothing to do with the specialized code, and that adding this layer of environmental protection and readiness for climate change would do nothing to change the market that we're looking at. There are different strategies that are focused on affordability.
I mean, I would just counter that we're adding to an already existing huge problem, right? And to me, what I've heard from my constituents is that housing and cost of living at every income level, whether you have a $1.3 million home or not, is a problem and a concern. And you know, I get that you're saying it's only 1% more, but, you know, it's on top of an already really difficult situation. So to me, you know, I'm not sure what the net benefit of all of this is gonna be for the environment and for Beverly, but I would suggest that the housing cost issue, to me, is by far the biggest issue I've heard about comparatively.
Yeah. Oh,
Well, to clarify too, though, we're only talking about new builds.
Right.
Right? So the affordability and housing costs, we're really only talking about this applying to new builds. So it's not about the affordable housing that's existing or retrofitted. That's the price of, when people are building new homes, they are $1 million homes in Beverly.
So we're
that's what it
talking
comes down
about $1 million homes moving forward? Is that what we're talking about?
Well, we're only talking about new builds, so yeah,
So these 14 homes is all that this applies to? Is that what you're saying?
would have applied to.
if it only applies to new builds, so it doesn't apply if you sell your house that's been in your family for a while. It's not a new build, it's not.
So how is this having any impact whatsoever if we're talking about 14 homes? I don't understand why we're even tackling this.
So maybe we can go back to Counselor Sweeney to refresh our recollection on sort of what the question was, or the reasoning behind the question you asked, which was, what kind of impact would the adoption of the specialized code have on sort of the, how did you put it, Counselor Sweeney, the middle? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the concern was in trying to better understand, and I appreciate the research done here, better understand the cost impacts beyond the presentation from the Department of Energy Resources, which focused primarily on the cost of passive house standard requirements on larger multifamily buildings. And this is certainly a helpful illustration to show what the cost would be on the handful of houses built in the last couple of years. So that was really the question, to try to better quantify some of the upfront costs, given that that was one piece of a few concerns that I had about this proposal.
Yeah, I would just add that, assuming the database is correct, you know, the research that Jordan did is accurate. Entry-level homes, the takeaway I get from this is that entry-level homes are not being, single-family homes are not being built in Beverly. And they haven't been for the past several years. So for me, the concern of would adoption of the specialized codes had an adverse impact on people who are trying to get into the housing market, young people primarily, you know, I would say that, I mean, I don't know what the age is of the people who bought these homes, but I would be willing to guess that it's not people who are presently renters who are moving into these $1 million homes. So the impact on young people who want to find affordability in Beverly for single-family homes, it's not clear that the specialized code would have any impact on that category of people who are trying to move into the housing market with home ownership. Yeah, Councilor St. Hilaire.
I mean, I guess what's clear to me is that the cost is going to go up by 1%. What's less clear to me is what is the benefit of 14 new homes over the course of 2 years in Beverly moving to this specialized code?
Councilor President Flowers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to check if my understanding is correct. I think, thinking about your question, Counselor, it seems like this is a relatively small category of new builds and single-family homes, but if I'm understanding correctly, part of the benefit would be broader than single-family homes if we move to specialized code, but because we're talking about multifamily larger development and municipal buildings and schools. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think the question here was prompted by the concern about affordability of housing. And I think what this shows is that the code is not going to have a big impact on this subset of housing in Beverly, meaning that we aren't going to see tons of emission benefits from the solar that goes on 14 roofs. We're also not going to see a lot of people struggling to get affordable housing because of its impact on this subset.
I
Councilor
mean, I would
St. Hilaire.
argue if you're raising my cost of my new home by 1.5%, I would like to see more of a benefit than whatever you just described. I mean, to me, that's a direct cost that we're passing on.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I can respond to that, I don't want to minimize the importance of that $12,000 or wherever that shakes out. That's a significant amount of money. It's also not just being poured down the drain, right? It adds to the value of that home. So when that home buyer, in this case, then does go to resell, right, their house has solar panels on it and it makes it more valuable.
20 years down the line, right?
I'll just make one, well, go ahead, Councilor Flowers, President Flowers, please.
To your point, Mr. Studd, about the money not going down the drain, I think we could assume that they would also see savings in their energy cost. I know one of your first slides, you showed the percentage increase for Massachusetts winter gas right now and Massachusetts winter electric. And I know my gas bill has gone up exponentially. So I'm thinking we could infer from this that the homeowner would see savings in that way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, the slide was intended to address, I think, Councilor Sweeney's concern about whether, as a broad swath, people who are renters who want to move into the home ownership category would be adversely affected by adoption of the specialized code. And what the market data indicates is that presumably that category of people simply are not going to fall into this classification of new homes. They're going to be really buying different kinds of new homes, perhaps condominiums, which will, we'll get to the multifamily market. But I don't want to put words in Councilor Sweeney's mouth either. So Councilor Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, that's correct. This is a helpful piece of information that was missing from the initial conversation to try to put some numbers behind this specific subset of the housing market. So I appreciate the work you've done, Mr. Stutt, to illustrate. And based on the numbers here, it is a relatively small increase to this subset of housing that has been created in the last 2 years. To the point that the chairman was talking about here about where I was coming from with these questions. So one, a piece of it was to get more tangible numbers to identify what's the impact to single-family housing. But in asking those questions, I think it's important that we're all cognizant of the larger housing picture in Beverly and what impact this proposal would have. And that's where I struggle when considering the cost versus the benefits for this one aspect. And there's others about National Grid, and I hope we can get to that point of the conversation, piece about the ADUs, other specifics. But keeping on this one particular aspect, the concern that I have is not necessarily that there is going to be the creation of a large-scale number of single-family homes in Beverly that are affordable, that'll help to alleviate some of the housing crisis we have here. What we're going to need to do as a city is to find ways to continue to develop types of housing across the spectrum. We've had a pretty significant concentration of larger-scale multifamily development here in downtown Beverly. There's going to need to be a need for some smaller-scale multifamily development in pockets of the city where it makes sense without really disrupting the residential character of a neighborhood. Those may be the type of housing units where we could try to make a dent in the issue we have for renters like myself that are really struggling to afford to buy a house in the city as opposed to some of the larger single-family homes. So I bring that up to say that this is certainly a piece of information that makes the argument stronger in favor of considering this proposal within that larger cost-benefit analysis, but this one segment of the housing market alone was never going to be the segment that would completely solve, for lack of a better term, Beverly's affordability crisis.
Sure. This is another slide in response to a Councilor Sweeney question. You had asked about how do we quantify the emissions impact of going to this code, and I didn't want to overpromise, and I don't think I overdelivered here. It's tricky to answer because of all the assumptions that would have to go into the energy supply and the energy efficiency in those units. But I took a stab at one use case here. So this is 100 River Street over by the Innocenti softball field. Just to give us a visual of a building, we have a sense of how big it is. This is totally not making any assumptions about what's going to happen over there. But that is a commercial building with a roof just shy of 20,000 square feet. If you were to build a new commercial building on that same footprint, same roof, and you wanted to go mixed fuel, so you wanted to have some natural gas hookups for heat or appliances, you would be required to put solar on that roof. You could put approximately a 200 kilowatt PV system on that roof, given its size, based on the assessment from Google Project Sunroof, which is a really cool tool. We've got 1,300 hours of usable sunlight in this location. That would generate 276 megawatt hours each year of zero carbon electricity. I took the liberty of making some assumptions about our grid carbon intensity between now and 2050, and just drew a straight line down to zero in 2050 to comply with our climate targets. So looking at those 276 megawatt hours each year, backing out the current and then future carbon intensity each year, we get 1,656 tons of CO2 avoided between now and 2050 on that roof, because nobody has a sense of what a ton of carbon is. I included the Beverly annual per capita emissions from Resilient Together, 10.9 tons of CO2 per person per year. So that would be approximately one person in Beverly's carbon footprint for 150 years by having this building put solar on the roof. And that's just one way this could take shape. There are a million different permutations of what building developers choose to do.
Yes, Councilor Sandler.
So one of the things I don't love about this proposal is I feel like the Beverly City Council sort of mandating or dictating something along these lines that our other surrounding communities don't mandate, puts us at a competitive disadvantage. Salem mandates it, and the others don't. If I want solar panels, I know where to get them. Have we done the 107K in savings seems like a lot over 20 years. I don't know how important that is to this project.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like, if there's real savings to be had, are we educating people on that and promoting it that way? I really don't love the idea that we're gonna be sort of mandating that you have to do this.
Yes, Councilor Feldman.
Thank you. To that point, I think that, from the last slide that we looked at, we're not really mandating this on personal individuals for the most part. There are only 14 homes built that would qualify in the last 2 years. So we're actually mandating developers that would be developing this would mostly impact passive housing, which would then in turn pass those savings on to the consumers buying it. So, we're really trying to say, we're not mandating that individual property owners, for the most part, because of that last slide that we saw, are complying with this new standard. We're talking about developers who frequently aren't even living in Beverly or in this community and building here. And then we're talking about what product they're selling. We're regulating the product that they're able to sell to our standards for our constituents. So I see this as a service that we're providing to our constituents to get them the best quality product for what is available on the market in Beverly.
Counselor
I
St. Hilaire,
would just say I completely disagree with that. I mean, I feel like anything we pass along to the developers, they're just gonna pass along to the end user, who's gonna be the buyer or the renter, and those are our residents. So to me, I hear what you're saying. I don't buy into the savings, number one, and number two, you know, if there is such great savings opportunities, let's promote it. Let's get people to buy into it on their own account.
Counselor Feldman?
Well, to that point, if the developer's passing that on, that's the decision the developer's making. The buyers of the condos don't get to choose that. They get to choose if they would buy passive housing in a passive housing market in another community, if that's what they wanted. And that's the energy
At a
savings.
more affordable rate.
Not necessarily.
The
That would
developer's
be
gonna
if
have
the developers
increased
are gonna-
cost to build this.
If they're gonna have to pass it on in other communities in Salem, then they're gonna pass it on
Not
here
in
too.
Danvers, not in Peabody, not in Middleton, not in Topsfield, not in Manchester,
Those are
not in Ipswich.
communities that
Those are all
people-
our surrounding communities. None of them have this. Salem is the
Correct.
only one.
But then why wouldn't the developers, people wanna live in Beverly though. So I don't know why we
People
wouldn't
want to be able to
make it-
afford to live in Beverly.
Let me,
Right, I understand that, but
I know, Counselor Sweeney, it looked like you wanted to jump into this tussle.
Not the tussle, but I would like to make a comment here, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. I just want to start by thanking you, Mr. Stuff, for this illustration. This is very helpful to provide some frame of context for both economic savings that would come from the reduced energy costs with the solar panel, but then also the reduction in carbon emissions, which, to me, that appears to be the big reason of why we're doing this, to try to have some measurable reduction in carbon emissions across the city over at least the 25-year period we're aiming at, if not longer. The one counterpoint that I want to make to the point that Councilor Feldman raised, and this kind of helps to explain how I am thinking about this, my only concern in the point about thinking of how these costs would be passed on and what the community values are and whatnot is that at some point, do we cross the line where there are costs being put on the developers through increased standards that lead to them making the decision not to build in Beverly? And I think restraining development to some extent is certainly in the interest of our community, which is why I, along with many of you all, voted to limit building heights downtown and try to fine-tune our zoning ordinance in a way that we're not overdeveloping as a city, but at some level, we are gonna need to create new housing. And my concern would be, tying in some of the points Councilor St. Hilaire made, if there is to be a significant amount of savings from making these type of investments in more green energy efficiency systems and solar panels and whatnot, wouldn't we get to a point where developers would be moving in this direction anyways, as we've seen with some of the recent developments in downtown Beverly? And then wouldn't we be moving in that direction in a way that wouldn't inadvertently price out any potential development? Like in this specific parcel, I would assume what's probably viable economically for somebody to build there is a larger multifamily development. And would we inadvertently price out any sort of development here by putting these standards in place? Even if we're modeling out the savings, do the upfront costs make the project cost prohibitive from a developer standpoint? I don't know, expect you to have an answer on that, and those are answers I've been trying to gather, both in talking to private sector developers, but to some nonprofit developers, like Mr. DeFranza of Harbor Light, and better understanding the impact of this proposal. So that would be the only thing I'd want to add to this discussion about costs being passed on. It's not a given that a developer would, after running the numbers, decide that a project is profitable or not. And my concern would be, we would hope to cut down on carbon emission in future projects, but then we'd actually be discouraging any sort of future project above a certain scale.
Yeah, I think it's a fair question, and to me, it's certainly clear that a lot of developers are already building to this standard. So some people are already doing this. What that signals to me is that it's feasible, it's cost-effective. They've figured out how to do that, how to make it pan out. And if this code can encourage others to build on what those other developers are learning and develop cleaner, greener buildings that benefit everybody, that's a a great positive impact in my eyes. And I hope that the marginal cost increase pre-incentive isn't so great that it does dissuade future development.
That's essentially the risk we run. We would set a standard that's more stringent, and we would essentially guarantee that multifamily housing would be built to passive out standards instead of hoping that the economic conditions and the existing stretch code facilitate that type of building in the future, but we would run the risk that by adding in costs, even if it's only 2 or 3%, that could potentially lead to a project being cost prohibitive.
And yeah,
That's the right way to think about it,
Yeah.
essentially. Is that what I'm asking? Am I
I
missing
think,
anything
I
there?
think that's a fair concern, and given the incentives that are out there, I think it's low risk, but
Okay.
I can't say that there's no risk without it.
Okay, I appreciate your input on that, Mr. Stott. Thank you.
Yeah, I can't kind of help myself. I want to respond to something Councilor St. Hilaire said, which is the idea that the city council were to mandate some requirement on developers. It may seem like a fairly trivial example, but city council mandates when people who are selling products, used cars comes to mind, that developers go out, that the business person goes out and obtains a bond, which costs that person money, part of his business overhead, because it protects the consumers, our constituents in the city, for a reason. Okay, we want to protect our constituents against a loss that might occur in the marketplace due to a business dispute or something going wrong with the business. We mandate that everyone has to shovel the sidewalk in front of their house for a reason. It puts a burden on the homeowner, whether they need to go out and buy a snow blower in order to take care of their walk, or whether it's simply going out and shoveling. It is the business of the council and of government at times to make a determination that a regulation should be mandated, even if that regulation imposes some kind of burden on the class of person or business that is on the receiving end of that regulation. So I don't see the idea that we're putting some business cost on a developer as relevant unless it really impacts in an adverse way the thing that I think is on most people's minds, which is housing development and affordable housing in the city. And for me, that is really sort of the question, because the cost that developers are experiencing right now is an upfront cost. The buyers of their units are as best we can tell, because of what a passive house building standard mandates, will be saving a lot of money in utilities by living in that building. So it is a question of where the cost gets shifted. If someone has to pay a little bit more for their unit, but saves a great deal in utility costs, then, at the end of the day, I don't think there are numbers. I don't think we can quantify exactly that trade-off. We don't know, because it's going to occur in the future. But it is, to my mind, really kind of beside the point of mandating something, because we do that all the time for our constituents.
If I will, or if I may. So I just realized we're actually pretty close on this, and not surprisingly, but I think where we sort of differ is, to me, this isn't in a vacuum, right? This isn't the only thing we're considering. And, I've been accused of being anti-housing. I've been accused of being bought and paid for by developers. I don't care about any of the labels. The bottom line is, for me, it's what's in the best interest of our residents, right? And, if you remember a year ago when the mayor was proposing his budget, it included tapping excess levy capacity to 700K, right? I voted against that, and I voted against the budget for that reason, because I see and I hear what I'm hearing from residents at every income level. It's about cost of living. It's about affordability of housing. And, you know, this will be the second time in less than a year that we're now voting for something that's going to increase the cost and affordability for our residents. And to me, that is the overriding issue here. This might be a nice proposal. Maybe it doesn't impact a ton of stuff in terms of cost, but it's another thing, and to Councilor Sweeney's point of view, another reason not to build something in Beverly, another reason not to be able to afford your house. I mean, it's just adding on, and it's now the second time in less than a year we're talking about another 1%, another 2%. I mean, at what point does that add up to something that's not worth doing? And, you know, again, if housing affordability is to your point, is the top issue, you know, then why are we trying to do something that's going to add to people's costs?
So I'll go back to my opening comments. I think it's a false construct to say this is an either-or problem. I think that there are friction points between achieving these two really important goals, and that it's the work of the council to address how to solve those friction points, not to say we have to choose between one or the other. Because what we haven't really talked about yet is, well, why the heck do we want a specialized building code in the first place, okay? It's about making our planet livable for our children and our grandchildren. And at some point, you know, the science says we've got to step up. We've got to step up to address that issue. And that's really what is behind the whole making buildings more efficient and reducing emissions. And, you know, that's not part of the dollars and cents of, you know, upfront costs versus costs that occur, you know, later, or savings that occur later. But it is really the whole point. And so I think to the degree that there are challenges in costs, so for example, I've spent a lot of time, as has Mr. Stutz, I know personally other members of the Clean Energy Advisory Committee have as well, I'm sure, listening to people online, going to listservs, 30 people in a Zoom meeting talking about this and what's going on in the various different towns. And one of the things I hear, and it's anecdotal, admittedly, is that, well, you know, the first time the developer built to a passive house standard, yeah, it cost a little bit more. But by the time they did the second and the third one, they understood what it was all about. And they actually got to the point where they were now building at a lower cost to build to passive house standards than they would otherwise have built to. So, you know, for myself, I don't swallow the argument that this is a permanent built-in premium to the cost of housing, whether it be, you know, our single-family homes at $1 million price point, or whether it's affordable housing, whether it's nonprofit or commercial rate housing. And I know that Councilor Rotundo has his hand raised and would like an opportunity to jump in here. So I'll hear from him. Counselor.
And I may be ahead of the conversation yet, and something that kind of just brought my attention was the regards of the savings with energy costs. And I think I go back and thinking about the heat pumps that were presented as an energy savings, which has not been seen, especially in New England right now. So to me, I know the goal of trying to save the planet, which we all want to do. I also know in the city, we're looking for affordable housing, and I know the single families is definitely not one of them, but you know, I think you and I, Mr. Stutz, spoke about those, 2, 3, 4 units that are being, possibly being created. But again, I go to the capacity of what we have currently from National Grid to even accept this type of a specialized stretch code, but as well as the true savings haven't really been seen in New England. And I know I looked into heat pumps and sat with a person and looked, and they were saying, like, because of the coldness of the New England weather and stuff, that there's other things that are added to it for makeup here and things like that there's not always necessarily that big savings, that you still need that other heating system to supplement it. So right now, it seems as if we're we still don't know from National Grid where we're at. We're seeing right now that they're increasing bills in order to fund mass save, which is almost seeing that bills are artificially being raised, and that's what I'm hearing right now, how the few bills are being raised, and we've just seen the special report from Channel 5 and the state legislators coming out and saying to our, energy companies, come back, you're crushing our consumers right now. We've had one of the coldest winters we've had in over 10 years, and we're failing it hard. So the affordable housing is definitely the big piece of it, but as well as, what is the real true cost savings that we don't even know yet? Because what they've already said to us once hasn't been really truly seen on the, heat pumps that we presented to me. So that's where I'm still very skeptical with this.
Yeah, if I may.
Go ahead. You go first.
I used to work in energy efficiency, and I have some strong feelings about the way that they've handled that. I think it's understandable, though, in this condition, because energy prices are skyrocketing. Those energy efficiency investments that are funded by ratepayers are hugely cost-effective, but not in year one. So in a situation like we're in now with incredibly high costs, I understand why they would have made that decision to kind of press that release valve and make it a little easier on ratepayers right now. To your point about the heat pumps and the very high cost that folks have seen recently, it's a problem and it's being addressed. There will be new rates for folks that are using heat pumps to heat their homes so that we get that in check and that it's at par with natural gas heating. But I think to the question at hand here about the specialized energy code, if you're building a passive house, that's about making that building more energy efficient. So regardless of your heating source, you're using less heating. You're paying less to run your heat pump, you're paying less for natural gas. So you're just reducing that energy load overall. And the specialized code allows for you to go with natural gas or electric as heat. So I think it's a big problem, and I don't want to suggest that that's not serious. It's a borderline crisis, but the specialized code isn't going to push that over and make that worse. People will still have the decision there. So I just want to share that.
I'll let you do a follow-up, and then Councilor Bowen.
Do we know what the capacity level is from National Grid to even accept this right now? Because right now, we're hearing there's not enough capacity, and this is from National Grid, that they're not even able to accept all of the new energy that's coming in through solar panels and stuff. So how far out is that? Are we getting so far ahead that we're we're going to get too far ahead that with all of this energy is just going to get lost? And that's what I'm trying to find out.
Jordan, do you have, did you decide to, okay, here we go. I'll let you start though.
So we do have some information from National Grid on their capacity. This is the distribution feeder heat map that you see there. You can see something similar, which is their hosting capacity maps, which shows how much capacity is available after accounting for projects that are already planned and in the queue. It's not great across the board. There are some areas where there's plenty of extra capacity, some that are already constrained. And that's why the state is undertaking this comprehensive energy grid planning process. So back in 2023, National Grid and Eversource were required to submit electric sector modernization plans to really lay out the investments that they're going to make, how they're going to deliver the necessary capacity across the grid to meet projected new load growth. And it's going to be a long-term process. It's not going to be fixed overnight. There are going to be some projects that folks want to develop that can't happen in the immediate term. So we're going to have to grapple with that. But what I keep coming back to is the fact that if you're building passive house, you're not necessarily adding a ton of new load, right? You might be heating with natural gas and just using less of it. So I think we have a challenge here. We want to keep working on this. This is one of the things that Andrew raised when he came and joined us at the CEAC, and we want to be good partners in that fight and make sure that National Grid stays at the table here and that we can talk through this with them. Sarah, I don't know if there's anything you want to add. This is an area of
If you could come up to the podium, please. And just for the record, your name.
Yep, Sarah Cullinan. I sit, I'm on the Clean Energy Advisory Committee. I also sit on the state's Grid Modernization Advisory Council, and I'm a former analyst at the Department of Public Utilities. So I know this sector very well. I've read each one of the electric sector modernization plans and all thousands of pages. So the state is taking a proactive approach to building out the grid to provide the capacity that's going to be needed to meet all of the load requirements of the state's decarbonization goals. It is a long-term process. You can't build the grid overnight, but it is happening. And I think one of the things that you can really kind of lean on in the specialized code that gives some flexibility is the fact that you can pre-wire for things like solar. So say the capacity isn't here today, you're setting up your home, an investment that's, any new building, 20, 30, 40-year investment to be ready for the requirements of the future. So you're taking that cost off the table of someone in the future by preparing it today. And the capacity will be there as the grid is upgraded.
Yeah, I want to add on to that. So I've had an opportunity to speak with Joseph Monaco, who's the local grid representative. Councilor Rotundo suggested I speak with him to just sort of get some facility with this question. And you've spoken very articulately, probably better than I can, about, in essence, the process, both of you. The electric sector modernization plan is a requirement for all utilities in the state to be filed with the Commonwealth. They have to be renewed every 5 years. And the one that Mr. Monaco sent to me was, I forget, 149 or 179 pages. It's very data dense, not a lot of narrative to it. It's very technical. So when I spoke with him after I took a look at it and we talked about it, basically what he said is, listen, there are challenges in the system because the system is going through a lot of changes. But it's our job as National Grid to meet those challenges. We will deliver. Are there sections, are there distribution lines within Beverly that might have to have additional load capacity added to them for a given project? Sure. Well, in fact, that always happens pretty much. There's nothing really new about that. What's new is that because we're trying to switch to a new form of energy, because you're trying to get rid of petroleum-based natural gas and move to more electricity, it means that the work that has to be done to upgrade the grid to meet those changes in the marketplace are more robust. Like the electric sector modernization plan is a relatively new state requirement, but it was created as one of those planning and forecasting tools to do just what we're talking about, which is, and what Councilor Rotundo was talking about, which is, do we have the capacity? The plan is there to evaluate whether we have the capacity and then project and plan out how we go about meeting those changes so that we do have the capacity. So at the end of the day, what I took away from my conversation with Mr. Monaco is, yeah, there are challenges, but in effect, that's nothing new. It's just the challenges in the context of adopting, a greater electrical distribution and moving away from national gas. I'm going to let Councilor Rotundo and then to you, Councilor Sweeney.
So I guess this is where I'll get at is, did he give you a time frame of how long it would take to build out this infrastructure, so to speak? And then the infrastructure build out gets passed on to the ratepayer, correct? That would be my guess. So that's why I was hoping that someone from National Grid, because those are the questions I have is, if we don't have the capacity currently, which means it's going to have to be built, how long will it take to build that out? We're seeing the transmission line that cost $100 million. Different project, but the same idea is, it's not as if that $100 million, that's being spread out amongst all the ratepayers. It's not like they're assuming the cost. We're assuming the cost still. So I want to know is, how is that planned out? Do we have that type of information? Is it 10 years? Is it 15 years? Is it 20 years? Is it this much millions of dollars? Is it this much billions of dollars? I don't know, and those are the kind of things that we have to look at, some of the collateral that's gonna happen with this.
Yeah, just briefly, yes, it's going to cost money. It costs money to build a highway, it costs money to repave Cabot Street. Any kind of infrastructure upgrade costs money. And in some way, it gets transferred to the customer base, whether that is through the taxpayer or the person who, walks into the store and puts their card down to pay for a service. Infrastructure upgrades and changes always cost money. They will cost money. I guess I come back to why are we trying to make this change? We're trying to get away from carbon-based, petroleum-based energy system. And yeah, it's going to cost money to do that, but are we doing it just for the heck of it? No, we are not doing it just for the heck of it. We're doing it because there is a real urgency, a real challenge to meet the climate change, the changes in the climate that we see. And again, that, the reason behind why all of this is happening has to be kept in mind, because it's not simply an exercise of, gee, let's see if we can do this. There's a real compelling reason behind why this change is taking place. So I guess I would say, yes, there are going to be costs. Yes, we're all going to share it. Guess what? We need to step up and acknowledge that we have challenges. It may cost in lots of different ways, direct and indirect. It may cost us some money to do this, but if you look at the alternative of doing nothing, what do we end up with? And that is really the reason that we're doing this, because what we end up with if we don't make any changes is not necessarily a future that at least my constituents, I think, or I or my grandkids and kids want to see. So, yeah, go ahead. And then I'm going to go to Councilor Sweeney. And
This is
Councilor
just
Bowe.
in direct relation to that. It's not a question. I just want to clarify that this electric sector modernization plan and the cost passed on to the consumers is happening whether we pass this or not.
Exactly.
Yes.
This is like an aside. Like, I agree with all of your concerns. Like, I am paying more for National Grid. I am one of those consumers. But that's like a completely different problem as far as I'm looking at things, because none of these things, these are going to happen. These rate increases and being passed on to the ratepayer is already a problem, and it's already happening. And so this, if anything, I feel like is part of a solution to put more control back into the ratepayers' hands if we can establish less reliance on the grid. So I just want to clarify that. Yep. You went on for a little bit on the better, yeah. The more, the greater, our better nature, yes, and our, the save the world part of it. But I just want to say that it's a problem. Well, regardless.
I do think that's actually not a bad thing to do. But
it's not.
Councilor Sweeney first, I think, and then
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I believe. And then
I'm going to focus my comments and questions on this specific section, but then I would like to discuss some of the larger points about the rationale you raised, why we're doing this, our shared commitment to the climate and to Beverly's next generation here. But specific to the points that Councilor Rotundo was making about the grid. So the infrastructure investment I view as one piece of it, right? The load management piece and the need for National Grid to modernize their electric infrastructure. And this may be a question you'd be able, Ms. Cullinan, you said your last name was? Okay, I wanted to make sure I got it right. You may be able to answer this. So there's one piece of the puzzle about the actual load management, but then the second question I have revolves around National Grid's plans for the generation of electricity in the future. Because as we all know, only a fraction of the electricity that National Grid produces and distributes comes from renewable energy sources. And of course, if we expand solar panel usage throughout the city as a piece of these newer buildings under this standard, I mean, many are already generating their own electricity, some fraction of that from on-site solar, but the rest of that's coming from National Grid and wherever that electricity may be sourced, natural gas, oil, propane, a whole host of different sources of energy cited here in the initial presentation. So this is a long way of introducing my question. We're facing an uncertain period in terms of the expansion of offshore wind as a viable alternative energy source, given the stance the new administration's taken on that. there hasn't been a whole lot of expansion in a number of years of any nuclear power source in the country for a variety of reasons. And so, from your position and having some understanding of this, do you see us, or National Grid more specifically, utilizing some other alternative energy sources if and when the time comes that there's an increased need for electricity, so that we're not just kind of inserting a middleman in hoping to work toward a goal of bringing more renewable energy, but in reality, it's just increasing utilization on a grid and system that's continued to be funded by fueled by fossil fuels?
Yeah, so the state does, the state has, so, yeah, I think the state is remaining committed to developing offshore wind. Even given a potential couple-year challenge to continuing development of offshore wind, 4 years is small in the long-term timeline, and the state is a international leader in offshore wind development and will continue to be that. So there are robust plans for meeting the entire load of the state in a 100% decarbonized future based on offshore wind and solar, supplemented by Canadian hydro and other smaller kind of supplementary sources. But there is sufficient land capacity plans to produce all of the generation that's needed to meet a decarbonized future by 2050.
Okay, thank you. And so to better clarify, do you know what percentage of the energy the National Grid uses to produce their electricity? What percentage of that comes from fossil fuels? And by saying 100, yes, currently, do you have any ballpark?
60%? 60 to 70?
60? And we would get to a
Mostly
point where
natural
that
gas.
number is 0% by 2050?
So it won't be fully zero.
Okay.
Where the goal is net zero, and so there will be a small amount of carbon-based fuels still used. Those will be offset by carbon capture to a small extent, and then producing, carbon capture and other kind of nature-based solutions to bring it to net zero.
Okay. So essentially, I voiced my concerns here that the greater the strain on the electrical grid, the potential that National Grid or any electricity provider may rely on a higher percentage of fossil fuels in the absence of large-scale generation from alternative energy sources of renewable energy. Are those concerns, I guess, for lack of a better way to phrase this question, are those concerns misplaced? In that we know, especially with actions like this, that we're going to have a greater reliance on the grid. Assuming that grid meets the first step in terms of the infrastructure and we don't end up in a situation with increased blackouts or some of the concerns that come alongside these type of expansion of electrical usage. That's piece one. Then on the second piece, we're not going to end up in a situation where National Grid or any other electrical provider is going to rely on just fossil fuels because they're available, in that the load is greater and there's not a reliable alternative energy source. That's a misplaced concern, or is that a real unknown that we're entering into here?
No, I mean, I don't think I think it's not something that I guess I'll go back to what I said before, in that, like, the state has a comprehensive plan for making it to the net zero future. I do not think there should be a concern about blackouts not having sufficient energy. Part of that is that currently we're heating our homes with natural gas. So you're either going to be still using natural gas to heat your home, or you're going to be using electricity that's also produced by natural gas, right? So you're using carbon-based fuels regardless of whether you're heating your home directly with it or if you're using a heat pump. From electricity.
Which kind of ties back to my first question. Really, I'm asking all these questions to better understand what the reality might be for Beverly. If we were, and it sounds like even if we don't adopt something like this, what the future would look like in terms of National Grid and its service to Beverly residents.
Yeah.
A whole host of different
But I guess in terms of the
capacities.
specialized code, adopting the specialized code and putting these new requirements on buildings is not going to change the trajectory of the state's plans to decarbonize It's not going to change the load that's projected for the grid.
Okay,
They're
that's
planning-
really the big
They're
piece
planning the
then.
grid based on a projection that every single building is electrified. So regardless of whether Beverly adopts the plan or not, that's already happening, and they're already proactively planning to build the grid to meet 100% electrified buildings. And so what I see the specialized code is really, in terms of the grid, is that you're pushing people to prepare those homes in the interim, whereas they might not be right there, ready to do it now, but these are, like I said, 20, 30, 40-year investments. You can see it as they'd be making a mistake in the next 5 years, and you're helping them prevent that mistake, so they don't have to go back and rebuild, reassess that building 5, 10 years down the line. Because they're gonna want that building to be electrified for that 20, 30, 40-year future.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thanks for sharing your insight on my
Yeah,
questions.
if I might, and I'll ask either one of you, I mean, what I've heard about passive house is the extraordinary energy savings that results from building to that standard, in that the electric load from a house that is built to that standard is way, 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 way lower, like by 80% lower than
Yeah.
a conventional house today. So to the degree you're talking about, can we meet the demand? The more houses we have built and buildings we have built to a passive house standard, really, it helps alleviate the load on the grid, not
Yeah.
increase the load
Yeah.
on the grid.
And to the point of, so if you're thinking about like the multiple uses of natural gas, whether it's through your heating system or through the grid, heat pumps in your home are more energy efficient they use less primary energy. And so using a heat pump, even if you're using more electricity, and yes, in today's rates, that electricity is more expensive, it will not be by next season. There's a plan to make rates equivalent for natural gas to heat pumps. But even if if the operating cost of that heat pump is more expensive, you're actually, over time, using less primary natural gas fuel to heat your home with that heat pump, whether you're taking it from the grid or from heating your home directly. So the heat pump just uses less fuel, full stop, to create the same amount of heat on a BTU basis.
I want to be respectful of the other folks. Counselor Bowen, I believe you're next, and then Counselor St. Hilaire. Okay.
Thank you. With a lot of sort of big hypotheticals also floating around, I want to bring us back to the specifics of implementing the specialized code at this point in Beverly. And in particular, this conversation about costs and benefits. I think one of the real benefits that's been lost since our last conversation is the access to additional funding as a community. And as a coastal community where we're more vulnerable than some of our neighbors to sea level rise, to other impacts of climate change, I think we have additional urgency to not only reduce our contribution to those harms, but also to, access state programs and make our own plans for resiliency in the face of what's already happening because we are too late to make these changes already. So just want to sort of bring back into the conversation the fact that passing the specialized code, while it has some costs that are typically offset by incentive programs in order to make them feasible so that they don't hamper the kinds of development that we're looking for, and really implementing standards that in the long run do benefit our residents in a way that's cost effective. Passing that code is one of the requirements of accessing some of the funds we're, as a community, counting on. If we choose not to, at this point, join some of our neighbors in passing this code and sort of being not at the leading edge, but in the middle of the pack on bringing the market into where it needs to be, we'll miss out on those funds and may need to take on more of the costs of things like resiliency plan for Lynch Park and Oak Bear Park on taxpayers in Beverly, rather than sharing that cost with some of our inland neighbors through state funds. So I think it's important to think about how, like, the overall impact, not only on specific buildings that would be subject to the specialized code, but also on our whole community, and think about the costs and benefits at that scale too. So to me, that's a really compelling reason to adopt the code at this point and have access not only to, you know, buildings that better suit our needs, but also to some of those incentives and grants that we can then have access to.
I know we want to move along the slides, but Councilor St. Hilaire, and then we'll get back to the slides. and
Yeah, I
keep moving
just want to
forward.
get back to, Mr. Chairman, your comments about saving the planet, right? And I think, you know, in framing this as a decision between if you're voting for this, you're saving the planet, and if you're voting against this, you're against saving the planet. I want to reject that framework with respect. I think Beverly has been a leader in the issues of climate change and sustainability. I want to give Mayor Cahill credit. This is a signature issue of his. All of us have taken a lot of votes in support of a lot of green initiatives, including solar panels all over the city and a whole host of other things. You know, and by your logic, we should support anything related to climate change. And I will remind you, we had a vote just last year on a geothermal HVAC at the library at a cost of 18 point whatever million it was. And as a council, we voted against that, largely due, in my opinion, to that cost being out of whack with whatever perceived benefit there was. And when looking at this proposal, you know, I think it's our duty to look at balance and look at the impacts, look at the benefits. And to me, you know, whatever impacts we're having in terms of saving the planet, I think are far outweighed by the idea that we're passing along direct costs to our residents. And to me, that it just doesn't add up. And so, you know, I look forward to future proposals. I look forward to voting in favor of proposals I think make sense. But to me, the cost of living issue is red hot. It's the number one issue, I think, aside from maybe roads and sidewalks that I hear about. And you know, I'm just not interested at this point in taking on, passing on another cost to our residents when we can't even define what the benefit is to doing this.
Respectfully, I hear you. I want to say that I entirely reject your suggestion that because that by the logic that you say I'm using, we would approve everything down the road. I think a real effort has been made in this process, just, you know, to use this immediate example, to really bring balance to the discussion. And to say right up front in my comments that there is a tension between these two important goals. So I thought your reference to red hot was sort of an interesting one, given the, you know, the impetus behind, what's happening with the climate. But I'll leave that aside and let's get back to the slides.
I'm going to skip, okay, thank you, Sarah. I'm going to skip back a little bit because we did not cover these slides, but did want to highlight this at our previous Clean Energy Advisory Committee meeting in February. After hearing from you all, we realized we really wanted more perspectives from affordable housing developers. Really grateful that Andrew DeFranza was able to join us. We are also joined by Mark Sandine from the Lexington Affordable Housing Trust, who's been doing a lot of work in this space. And just wanted to share some of the quick takeaways from that discussion. Andrew did cite some of the major challenges that he's facing when it comes to building affordable housing, unrelated to the specialized code. But because we started this meeting, the CAC meeting, with that stated goal that we all need to be working together to develop more affordable housing and ensure that we're doing that in the most sustainable way possible, it was really helpful for us to hear about the challenges that he's seeing. So increasing building costs, the challenges he's faced with previous developments, the severe frustrations with National Grid, and then the need to ensure that everything that we're doing with regard to housing, we are doing through a lens of racial equity. Understand that's been a big challenge for him and the folks he's working to serve. He called on us directly, and I think we were all enthusiastic to say yes, to work with him and with you all to figure out what we can do to address the challenges with National Grid. Again, I don't think those are directly tied to the specialized code, but if we want more affordable housing and we want it to be greener, we all need to lend a hand there and make sure that there's some kind of forum and conversation that is ongoing and that we don't lose sight of that and we put the necessary attention on it to keep that issue going. He also said that he expects his future multifamily housing projects to be passive house in Beverly. And he was recently awarded a low-income housing tax credit for a project that is passive house in Hamilton. There's no specialized energy code requiring passive house development in Hamilton. That's the way they chose to do it. Because of that, they got this extra tax credit, which is pretty significant. I don't know his specific one, but those are major chunks of funding. And I've seen the plan for this year's low-income housing tax credit award criteria, and where it previously awarded, I think, 5 points for passive house development, it's now 10 points. There's twice as much emphasis on building to this standard. I think that's a pretty good indication that folks are going to continue building passive house in order to make sure that they are favorably considered for that significant funding. Mark shared with us some of the details of a project that he has just signed an agreement on with Causeway Development. It'll be 40 all affordable housing units. The developer has since made passive house their design standard for all of their projects. And he shared with us that because of going passive house and combining that with the mass save incentives, that the economics are excellent for the developer. That's in that case, doesn't mean that's going to be the case everywhere, but that's his experience, and I was really encouraged to hear that. This is just a little bit of a summary. We talked about the collective action needed. The fact that more and more developers are already building to passive house, whether or not they're in specialized energy code communities, and I should note that's now 30% of the Massachusetts population is a specialized energy code community. There are a lot of developers that are already good at doing this. They've figured it out. They're no longer in that first phase of figuring it out. They are doing it as their business model, and we can call on them when we need them in Beverly. One of the other things that was flagged was that the incremental cost from stretch code, what we currently have, to the specialized energy code, which requires passive house building, is really small, especially relative to some of the other challenges, and especially after you consider the mass save incentives that can nearly account for that whole cost incremental. They did both cite some of the big challenges outside of the code that are more focused on zoning, things like the minimum parking requirements that really increase the cost for developers. And then Mark shared a lot of details about CPACE, commercially property assessed clean energy. Some changes have been made. Affordable housing developers can now finance 25 or 35% of their project through the CPACE program, and Beverly has already adopted that, so it's available to developers here.
If I just want to stop you and address just a couple of points in the last two slides. One is to underscore the meeting at the Clean Energy Advisory Committee when Mr. DeFranco was there and Mark Zander was there as well, that it was very interesting that the cost factor the developers were citing that was having a greater impact on their business model and their prospective developments was really around parking requirements, not around the stretch versus the specialized building code, which I just thought was interesting, given that we've had conversations in Beverly about parking requirements and had to respond to those in a couple of different ways. The other thing I want to mention, Mr. DeFranco listed 4 things, and I've had a lot of interaction. A lot of interaction with him in the last few days, talking about all of the relative issues. His frustrations with National Grid, which he cited that bore on his frustrations of developing an anchor point, really had nothing to do with stretch versus specialized code at all. The anchor point is not built to specialized code standards. It really had to do with his, if you will, the bureaucracy of National Grid, which as a council I think we can all appreciate. the difficulty of doing that. But one of the concrete things that came out of our conversations of that were listed in his sort of 4 frustrations, really I was able to pick up with Mr. Monaco from National Grid and talk about the National Grid's response rate and process to providing connections, once the electrical connections to the buildings. And so I think, you know, I don't want to overpromise, but, you know, one of the things that Mr. DeFrancis sort of go ahead on saying, you know, he can live with the adoption of the specialized code is the idea that the city council will work with him to help address some of the issues with National Grid. And I raised those with Mr. Monaco today, and I think I made, you know, some progress along the lines of dealing with that. I'm not Pollyannish to think that National Grid's stripes are going to change as a bureaucracy. But, you know, as I said, I think, you know, when I use the double pole example, City Council has offices and leverage that it can use in interacting with National Grid, and I think that's something that is incumbent upon us to try to do across the board, regardless of the adoption or not adoption of this code, to help stakeholders in the development community who we want to see building in Beverly. So I'll leave it at that. Oh, yes, Councilor Sweeney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the summary. Unfortunately, I was unable to make this meeting due to a conflict, so I'm glad to hear that the conversation went well and that you were able to relay the details to us. One question I have that I know has come up in conversations with Mr. DeFranza and other developers about this proposal is a handful of the cities that have adopted the specialized stretch code, including our neighbors, Salem, are categorized as gateway cities. And as gateway cities, those municipalities have access to an increased amount of funding to help subsidize the cost of affordable housing, to help defray some of the upfront investments in green energy systems that Beverly will not qualify for because we're not a gateway city. And additionally, I didn't go through the exact numbers, but I know Salem is a CDBG Community Development Block Grant eligible community. We're not. We're hoping to change that. But again, that's another stream of federal funding that could go toward defraying the cost of some of these larger housing projects. So my specific question there is, that's a benefit that a city like Salem can look to and say, yes, we may be increasing the upfront cost of housing by adopting this proposal, but we know we can lean on state and federal funding available to us as a gateway city. That would be available to Harbor Light Homes, most likely, if they were to develop a project in Salem. That would not be available to them in Beverly. So did that come up in the conversation at all? That is Beverly in a position where the math is different because we don't qualify for some of these incentives that Salem or other gateway cities or CDBG communities do?
It did come up. I'd heard that from a previous developer. And I don't know that there's anything that we can do in Beverly to make Beverly a gateway city. If there is something that can.
We'll have better luck on the CDBG piece if I were to guess, but even that's been a challenge.
And that's something where if that's a realistic opportunity, I mean, I'll stand here and advocate for that because it sounds like a really helpful way to make sure that we can get more affordable housing in Beverly. Mark in Lexington is certainly not a gateway city. He was not benefiting from any of those funds and talked through the finances at a level that went beyond my comprehension. But they were able to get it done without relying on that. And I found that to be compelling too.
Yeah, just for the record, Swampscott also has adopted the specialized code and maybe is in some fashion more comparable to us than Salem as a non-gateway city.
And so Mr. DeFranza didn't seem to think that would be a challenge in terms of his organization looking at projects in Salem versus Beverly, if both were to adopt the same specialized stretch code?
He didn't raise that in our discussion. What did come up is that he's very interested in any funding that is out there that can make this easier. I think that's a general statement, not limited to the specialized energy code. But yeah, it's clear that he's doing everything he can to scrap together the necessary funding to make affordable housing happen here.
Yeah, actually, if I may interject, correct me if I'm remembering this wrong, but he had not heard of the CPACE program, which is a funding stream that is directly focused on these kinds of developments. I don't know if you have a slide that.
I don't think I have more details.
It's
a bullet here.
a state funding mechanism, sort of like tax increment financing. It's not exactly like that, but it was not one that he had, Mr. Francis was particularly aware of, and had, said he would, try to explore.
he
But
expressed
it's another
interest.
program out there.
He expressed interest in that if it were available.
Yeah.
And it is. And this is, I guess I hadn't talked through this. We got a little bit more information on the Climate Leader Communities program. There were some question marks when I was here last. So there will be 2 separate funding tracks: the Accelerator Grant Program for actual construction of new buildings in the city. Each municipality can go after this grant program one time for a maximum of $1 million. And then there's the Technical Assistance Program, where you can get $150,000 to help with planning. What I do want to note is that there are already 48 municipalities that have adopted the Specialized Energy Code, and there's $60 million in this pot of funding. So not that I would encourage anybody to act more quickly than they are comfortable to in order to access that funding, but this is time sensitive. If we want to bring in that funding for municipal projects, there's no promise that that's going to be there for the long haul.
Oh, Councilor Spang, thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a clarifying question. Is the up to $1 million only available for new construction of municipal buildings?
I believe it is strictly new construction, yes. And there are funding programs in the Green Communities program that can cover the cost for renovations and other projects.
So if we're not anticipating building any new buildings, we wouldn't be able to get access and use those funds?
It can also be applied to solar.
New solar arrays?
Yeah,
Okay,
and there might be more. That's extend my memory. Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah, just to respond, one of the things that we are sort of researching, but I don't have a final answer on, really, is for the climate leader money, how exactly the decision is made, or what the decision is as to whether or not it can be directed to a particular project, or goes into the general fund. I'm still trying to learn a little bit more about exactly how that applies. Either way, one way or another, whether it's affordable housing or tax relief, it's a benefit. But I think
Those are only, I think they're only for municipal buildings, if I'm not mistaken. It's not for.
It does have to be a specific project. That part of the application is showing that you've done the planning and you know which project.
So it could theoretically apply to the City Hall project, maybe?
If it were new construction.
Building new, got it. Councilor Crowley, did you have okay. Councilor Sweeney.
Mr. Chair, just following on Councilor Spang's line of questioning regarding some of the specifics. So I have in my notes, and I appreciate the clarification Councilor Spang made about this applying specifically to new municipal projects. I have in my notes that it's, where is it, one time per 3-year cycle. Does that mean that there's a 3-year window in which the city of Beverly could apply for this funding? Does it mean that there are recurring 3-year increments where if we were strategic in lining up new projects, we could leverage this funding stream multiple times?
I don't know when that 3-year, if that 3-year window is tied to the adoption date in Beverly, or if it's preset by the state, and we're somewhere in the middle of it now. I'm not sure. We can easily get that information for you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stutt. And do you know, this may be another follow-up question, the Mass Save program, I know a significant part of that's, well, I learned recently, a significant part of that's funded through a surcharge on natural gas and other fossil fuel energy bills. Do you know if this funding stream comes from surcharges on energy bills for fossil fuels as well?
Good question. I'm not sure if this is ratepayer funded or not. My guess is that it is, but I'm not sure. Sarah, do you? No, it's ACP. Oh, it is? Oh, okay.
Could you repeat for the microphone?
It's not ratepayer funded, I know that, but I think it's alternative compliance payment funding. So it's payments that electricity generators have to make if they can't meet the renewable energy standards of the state. They have to pay a fee instead of acquiring the clean energy credits. And I'm pretty sure the funding comes from there.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's helpful, thank you.
Thank you.
This is the last slide, which isn't all that different from what you've seen before, just an overview of many, but not all of the incentives available to build to the specialized energy code standard. And then at the back of this slide deck is a whole bunch of extra content that I'm not going to walk through now. Some of it you saw last time, but I'll send it out and you can look through it on your own time.
So thank you, Mr. Studd. I kind of assumed that whatever questions or comments folks wanted to make probably were brought out in the course of the slide deck, but I'm certainly open to having additional conversation or questions now that we've sort of gone through that. So, Mr. Sweeney, Councilor Sweeney, I see your hand.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for talking so much this evening. You guys have all been very helpful. I want to say I appreciate the research that you put into bringing the details and answering many of which were my questions that were posed at the last meeting. The only comments that I haven't made, Mr. Chairman, that tie to a point of discussion that you had introduced earlier in the conversation about why we're doing this and the need to take more proactive action than we had in order to do our part in combating climate change locally, which I think is certainly an admirable goal and a way to approach this proposal, and I appreciate your taking the initiative in order to move Beverly in that direction. The challenge that I am encountering in weighing the cost-benefit analysis, even though many of my concerns were assuaged in the data that was presented across a whole host of different categories here, is ultimately what I view this as boiling down to is we, as a city, already have a fairly stringent stretch code that we've adopted alongside a handful of other municipalities when we became a green community as one step in a process, and we've undertaken multiple steps towards playing a role locally in combating the effects of climate change and doing our part to reduce carbon emissions. So I think we have certainly been moving in the right direction on that end. And so rather than evaluating whether or not these steps and this movement is necessary, which I don't think anybody on this council questions, I'm looking at whether this specific step moves us far enough in the right direction to outweigh the costs. And I think that's where I may have a different view than some of my colleagues based on the points that we've discussed tonight, where we talk a little bit about the benefit of passive house standards for large multifamily buildings. I don't dispute the energy savings and the benefits there, and I think that's why we've seen developers, even in communities where the specialized stretch code hasn't been adopted, move toward that standard. And actually, though I hope this building is not built, it's gonna be out of our hands most likely as a city, but the discussion around potential development on Folly Hill that has been taking place in the planning board, I attended a planning board meeting a few months ago, and the developer there mentioned that in the event that they clear state permitting, which again, I hope that they do not for concerns that don't have anything to do with the energy efficiency of the proposed building, but they had said that if that building is to be built, it would be built to passive house standards. And so what that tells me is that the bar that we've set is high enough in that we've already made progress toward reducing carbon emissions, which is a good thing. Developers, especially with larger scale multifamily developments, if they're gonna make that leap themselves, my concern is, do we then raise the bar too high for certain other types of development, whether it's different types of larger multifamily development or smaller multifamily development, to the point that while we are doing so out of an altruistic place and a desire to make our community a greener community and to reduce carbon emissions, do we inadvertently raise the bar too high by implementing these standards so that there are some abstract future developments that don't get built because we've raised that bar too high and we don't have some of the incentives available to cities like Salem to offset those costs, where if we were to just leave things as they are, we've already set a floor that's pretty high in terms of future development being energy efficient. Many developers are already going above and beyond that, and we leave some wiggle room between the two to allow for future development that might not otherwise take place. That's really what I'm wrestling with at this point as the highest, determining factor of whether or not I'm to support this proposal. So there's no question in there. I just wanted to leave that comment out for my colleagues after our discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, no, I think collectively, the council is asking and, raising exactly the right questions. I think that really is the question, what are the trade-offs? Hopefully, the information that has been, provided in these two subcommittee meetings has been helpful and educational. Regardless of how this vote comes out, we're going to continue to face the challenges as a community and as a state to grapple with the friction between these two goals. Again, as I said in sort of my opening comments, I see our role as city councilors to run to the problem. And to the degree that there are problems, I would like to see the council use its good offices to engage with state policy and officials and regulators, and interact with stakeholders, because I think that's what our constituents expect from us, is to do the hard work, run to problems. So I'll leave it at that, because otherwise I'll be quite repetitive. I think we're pretty much in conclusion. Yes, Councilor Spang.
I just would be remiss to not recognize that we've talked a lot about Mr. DeFranza tonight, but he's here. So,
I was getting there.
okay.
Yes, Andrew DeFranza has joined our meeting just as we are wrapping up. Mr. DeFranza, would you like to come forward and make any comments or answer any questions?
I just left Salem City Hall, where they were also talking about me extensively, for good or for ill, but anyway, we'll see that tomorrow, I suppose.
So as we have all in the slides and in various comments referred to our conversations that many of us have had with Mr. DeFranza, he has made himself available here, more or less at our close. If you want to follow up with any specific questions, go ahead, Mr. Sweeney, Councilor Sweeney.
Just one, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. DeFranza, for taking
Sure.
some time
Happy
with
to be
us. I had posed a question to Mr. Stutt in his recollection of the conversation you and others had. My question was around the fact that Beverly is not a gateway city, but Salem and some of the other communities that have adopted this specialized stretch code are. From your vantage point, do you see the lack of funding that Beverly would be able to access that Salem can through some of these gateway city programs and also the CDBG program, and thinking of another stream of housing funding that would change the calculus significantly enough for a city like Beverly wondering whether or not adoption of this stretch code is too much of a deterrent for the creation of affordable housing and defraying some of those upfront costs without having that gateway city or CDBG funding available?
That's a great question. Yeah, it's not speaking to the whole rest of the matter, but to that specific question about the gateways. And that, assume that came up, that there's a lot of different sorts of resources that are available to them. And the CDBG can be available, even in non-gateways, but the gateways tend to get more of it. There was a day when we got some, but it's been a long time. So short version is probably not. There are other variables that make that a challenge, but my guess is the gateway variation is there's probably not enough there resource-wise to make that much different. That's the short version.
Okay, that's helpful to hear, thank you.
Yeah. Josh Allen could probably fund all of the energy efficiency we might need now going forward. I'm just saying, if you want to talk about that contract, Councilor Feldman. Okay, thank you. That was for you.
Anyone else? Well, Mr. DeFranza is kind enough to drop in on us. If not, I think you're off the hook.
That was great. It's
Your
really good.
timing was perfect, the way you like to have it.
Yes, this is how I like to go to church also.
But thank you very much for,
Sure.
for showing up.
Yeah.
I appreciate it.
Nice to see you all. Appreciate everybody. Thank you.
I would, and I guess, any closing comments you would like to make, Mr. Studd, from either you or other members of the? I feel like we. Okay. Okay. With that, so it's my intention to keep this in committee and bring it forward for a vote, take it out of committee at next Monday, refer to the full council for discussion and a vote at this time, just procedurally, so you know sort of where I'm coming from. So we'll hold 30 through 30D this evening, and I would entertain a motion to adjourn committee of the whole. So moved. All those in favor? Motion carries 8-0. And a motion to adjourn legal affairs. All those in favor? Aye. Motion carries 3-0. Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Jordan, to you and members of the Clean Energy Advisory Committee. You guys have done a lot of work and certainly appreciate, all that you've brought to the table.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for dedicating so much time to this and to this discussion. It's been really helpful.
Thank you. Good night.